Hi guys, Dr. Rob Barrington here with some more nutrition advice. I wanted to talk today about chromium. Now, chromium is something that I've discussed before. I wanted to in particular talk about chromium today because I've been reading a fairly interesting study that looked at the association between chromium and the odds of having type 2 diabetes. Now this paper was published in the Journal of Nutrition, and it was a study that looked at about it was about 60,000 people, but they removed some of the people because they weren't adults or they weren't suitable for the study, and this got the numbers down I think to about 30,000. So there was still a fairly large population that they sampled. Now this study was interesting because it looked at people who had taken a dietary supplement in the previous 30 days, and about 60% of the individuals in this study population had taken some kind of dietary supplement in the previous 30 days. Now that's interesting for a start because it suggests that, and this population was from the United States of America, and now that's interesting because it suggests that people are starting to get the message about dietary supplements, and it does show that dietary supplements and taking supplements is actually more it's more likely than not. 60% of the people had taken a supplement in the previous 30 days, so therefore only 40% of the population hadn't. So that's promising. That's interesting that people are starting to become more interested in nutrition, and I think that is reflected on YouTube. When you come on, look at the videos now, there's lots of people talking about nutrition. You go on blogs, you go on websites, there's people talking about vitamin D, there's people asking questions about nutrition, and that's, I think, very different from even 10 years ago, where there was much more naivety around nutrition and the importance of it. And I think this is the generation that's that's coming through now, that's starting to grow up. They're starting to make that connection that perhaps previous generations, and perhaps it's not that they didn't want to, it's just they didn't have the information on the internet available to them. So I think the internet plays a part in this. The dissemination of information to people is starting to make people understand about the importance of nutrition. So that's the first thing about the study that was interesting. So there was about 60% of the people that had taken a dietary supplement in the previous 30 days. They then found that there was about 30% of the population that they sampled had taken a dietary supplement that actually had chromium in it somewhere in the supplement. So this is what they were interested in. They were looking at associations between chromium and type 2 diabetes. Of that sample population, about 0.7% had taken a dietary supplement that had chromium in the title of it. So let's assume that was some type of chromium supplement. It's not exactly clear what that meant, but in the title somewhere there was chromium, and therefore it was probably some type of a basic chromium supplement like chromium percolinate or something like that. So there were people taking chromium supplements. There were a lot of people taking just dietary supplements. Some of those would have been multivitamins, obviously, that contained chromium, but obviously certain people were taking specific chromium supplements. What the researchers found was that those people that took chromium containing supplements actually had a reduced odds of having type 2 diabetes. There was an inverse association between the intake of chromium in a supplement and the risk of type 2 diabetes. So this is very interesting because chromium is related to blood sugar disorders, and the first thing to say is that human studies assessing this role of chromium in blood sugar disorders have been very inconsistent. Many studies have looked at chromium, and they've supplemented with chromium to human populations, and generally from those studies it's quite difficult to assess the importance of chromium in human nutrition because the results have been so inconsistent. Some have shown positive effects of chromium, and some have shown no effect at all. Now I would suggest that the reason for that is that this brings up all of the problems of using human subjects in clinical trials, and the problem is it's very difficult to control human diets. Most of these studies are not performed in metabolic laboratories under very controlled conditions. They generally are free-living studies where the humans are given a supplement and then they go out and live their life, and then they come back into the lab, a couple of weeks later or a couple of months later, and therefore it's very difficult to control what those humans do with their lives. And it's very difficult to actually get them to take supplements when you give them. There's been many studies that have looked at the humans and how reliable they are at even recording dietary intakes, and they said that the results from these studies show that generally humans are actually quite unreliable when they're used in clinical trials. So you have to be very careful with your human subjects that are actually taking the supplements and actually following the protocol. So that's probably one of the reasons why these results are inconsistent. The second reason is that methodological flaws in terms of not understanding really the role of chromium, and this comes down to just the nature of researchers really, and whether they really understand their subjects. Sometimes I do question this, but they will use, for example, subjects that are replete in chromium in a chromium study. If your subject is not depleted in chromium, supplementing with chromium, it's obviously going to have no effect because they already have enough chromium in their body. And many of the studies, and I don't know whether this is done on purpose, obviously there is money coming into nutritional research for nefarious reasons, but I'm not sure if this is done on purpose or just through ignorance. Let's give people the benefit of the doubt and say it's through ignorance, but obviously if you supplement somebody with a nutrient and they have enough of that nutrient in their body already, the supplement is going to have no effect. So this is another problem with many of the human studies that have been done on chromium. And the third problem is that a lot of these studies just don't give enough chromium, or they don't give it for long enough. They expect 200 micrograms of chromium to have a major effect on a disease like type 2 diabetes in a week. It's absurd, and a lot of these studies have serious methodological flaws that can be pulled out within a few seconds of reading the paper. So it's strange that they go through peer review, but that's the nature of the beast. That's why scientists are trained in order to be able to pull these papers apart, and this is why I try and encourage all of my subscribers to learn how to read science and learn how to read these papers, so that you can go there yourself and you can have good discernment when you're understanding nutritional information. However, if we ignore the human studies that have been done and we look at the animal studies that have been done, chromium and the role of chromium in insulin and insulin metabolism is very clear. If you deplete animals, many mammals have been studied, rats, dogs, cats. If you deplete them of chromium, they develop type 2 diabetes. Most of the studies have been done in rodents, rats and mice, but if you deplete rats and mice of chromium, you give them type 2 diabetes. They get that within short order. But if you then reintroduce chromium back into the diet, those symptoms are reversed and the animal goes back to health. The animal models and the animal studies are much clearer, and that's because it's much easier to control the diet of an animal. It's unethical, for example, to take a known essential element and remove it from the diet of a human. There have been studies that have done that, and they're generally not done in the modern era. They've been done in the past, and the humans their health does deteriorate quickly. But animals, it is still not a nice thing to do, but it is classed as ethical. It will pass ethics. You will be allowed to do that with animals, and therefore studies have been done on animals where they've depleted them of nutrients. Chromium is one of those nutrients that's been tested, and when you test animals for the effects of depleted chromium, they develop all of the symptoms you would expect of a disrupted insulin system. So there is very strong evidence that chromium is required as an essential element in the metabolism of glucose, and it's required for the function of the insulin hormone. How it works is not fully understood. Originally the hypothesis was that chromium was conjugated to a nicotinic acid and other amino acids to form what's called the glucose tolerance factor, sometimes referred to as GTF. And this glucose tolerance factor fitted in between the insulin hormone and the insulin receptor to act as a binding agent. if that binding agent was present, the insulin would not bind to the receptor, and therefore insulin sensitivity would fall. That was the original hypothesis of how chromium worked. Since that time, other studies have actually shown that chromium may actually have multiple roles. Chromium, for example, may actually improve the release of insulin from the pancreas, so therefore it potentiates the release of insulin. It may also have some kind of effect on cell membranes, increasing their fluidity, which would therefore improve the signal transduction of insulin through into the cell, which would then allow the glucose transporters to be put into the membrane, which would therefore decrease insulin resistance and improve insulin sensitivity. And there have also been other functions explained for chromium within the cell, within the actual transduction pathway, that may actually be a role for chromium. And chromium has been considered as actually having a cofactor role in certain enzymes. So there's multiple avenues of investigation at the moment, and this is why chromium is such an interesting nutritional topic. It's a lot like dietary fibre. There are active studies going on, and we really don't understand the nutrition of chromium, but we do seem to, from animal models and from epidemiology, there is evidence growing that people who are deficient in chromium develop problems with glucose metabolism. Now, if you were depleted in chromium and you had problems with your insulin system and your glucose metabolism, you would expect also to develop problems with your lipid metabolism, and that's exactly what we see with chromium. Those people that are deficient in chromium or have low chromium intakes appear to have this disrupted lipid metabolism. They have disruption to their lipoprotein metabolism, because these are all downstream effects of the disruption of insulin. Whereas I've talked a lot about insulin resistance. When insulin resistance develops, all the downstream effects that occur, including insensitivity in the hypothalamus to leptin, which means that your appetite regulation gets disrupted. You also get problems in the liver in terms of the metabolism of fatty acids, and you tend to get a disruption of lipoproteins as well, so therefore your cholesterol levels change. And these are all downstream problems caused by an insensitivity of the cells to insulin, and chromium is one of the important factors that sensitizes your cells to insulin. So if you have enough chromium in your diet, taking a dietary supplement of chromium will have no effect. However, if your diet is deficient in chromium, a chromium supplement will replete your body, replete your tissues of the chromium you require, and therefore your insulin system will work more efficiently. So therefore these studies that have been done on humans, many of the subjects may not have been depleted in chromium, so they produce inconsistent results. Is there enough chromium in our diet? No. All of the evidence that I've seen that have measured levels of chromium in the diet have shown that they're actually, most particularly the typical Western diet, but most diets are actually low in chromium. Now there is a controversy again in the nutritional literature, because many of the early studies that actually measured food components and measured the chromium in food may have been biased by the contamination from the materials they used to actually measure the food. There are small amounts of chromium, for example, in many scientific utensils and scientific containers, and that wasn't controlled for in some of the early studies. It was only after a while that they realized that many of the measurements they made had been contaminated by chromium that was in the scientific instruments that they used. So therefore, some of the early studies that showed, yes, we get loads of chromium in our diet, they have to be taken in that context, that they may have been compromised in terms of their methodology. Certainly, the consensus of the studies that I've read have shown that diets are generally they're not deficient in chromium, but they are certainly far too low in chromium. When you take into consideration competition from other minerals, and the fact that people often don't accurately report what they actually eat, when people are actually measured and their diets are looked at, overall most people are depleted in chromium. and they would benefit from a chromium supplement, in my opinion, whether that's from multivitamin or from a specific chromium supplement. That depends really on how much chromium you think you need and how depleted you are, and you'd have to look at your diet as a whole. But obviously this series of videos is hopefully giving you that information that you can make those judgment calls yourself. You can be your own nutritionist, because you'll always be the best nutritionist to yourself, because you understand, as long as you're honest with yourself, you understand what your body needs better than anybody else. So there is a lot of information on how much chromium to take. I wouldn't want to make a general recommendation, but somewhere in the region of maybe 50 to 200 micrograms of chromium in a reasonably absorbable form per day would probably over the long term be sufficient for most people. But there is obviously variation in that, depending on body size, depending on how much physical activity you do, and other factors as well. So you'd have to take those into account. This study also was very interesting because it shows an association, and I just wanted to point out that an association is not a cause and effect. Those people who had the most chromium, those people who took a chromium supplement had the lowest odds. They had the lowest risk of having type 2 diabetes based on the probabilities that they studied. Now, that's very, very interesting, but it doesn't prove cause and effect. It doesn't prove that the chromium supplement was the reason that they didn't have type 2 diabetes. There is obviously, as I've explained, a mechanistic way that chromium can prevent type 2 diabetes, and there are biochemical pathways that have been explained, and it's it's perfectly well known that chromium is related to the insulin function. However, it was an epidemiological study. It was only measuring an association. So if we look at those people that took a chromium supplement, what else would we find in their diet? Well, if you're the sort of person that is going to go out and buy yourself a chromium supplement, you've obviously done some research on nutrition. It would be the natural, logical thing to assume that the people that went out to buy a chromium supplement, most of them had read about nutrition. They'd either read books or they'd been on the internet. They'd seen and they'd watched videos. Perhaps they'd watched some of my videos. And they'd gone out and they'd decided that chromium was something they needed as a supplement. Those are the sort of people that are going to make other changes in their lifestyle, and those are the sort of people that are going to make other changes to their diet. So yes, the chromium is biochemically linked to a functioning insulin system, but these epidemiological studies do not prove cause and effect. They show associations. And you have to take that into account when you look at them. Those people taking the chromium supplement are also likely to eat a higher quality diet. They're also likely to make other lifestyle changes that improve their health, and therefore it may be these other factors that are actually the causative factor in the association. However, when you take into account the whole diet and you look at these studies in a more broad context, and you put together these epidemiological studies, what you do find is a very clear picture that those people that eat healthy diets, those people that eat high quality foods, and those people that have diets that have high levels of nutrients in them have a much lower risk of developing typical Western lifestyle diseases. And this picture is very clear, and this is becoming so clear now to nutritionists and researchers that guidelines are now being drawn up you see guidelines being drawn up in scientific papers of what a healthy diet is. It's getting to the point now where it's becoming so obvious what is causing disease, what is causing the Western lifestyle diseases, that even researchers who are very, very, you've got to remember, they're very, very tentative in their suggestions. They're very reserved people. They don't like to make solid conclusions based on data unless there is an overwhelming amount of data. And the fact that they're putting together certain nutritional recommendations and mentioning certain diseases suggests that this evidence now is becoming overwhelming. So I thought that was interesting. I will put the link to the paper in the comments box below this video, and it's an interesting paper. And those people that say you don't need to take dietary supplements, there's arguments on both sides, but I would say it'd be very easy to argue that dietary supplementation is becoming necessary now. There are a number of nutrients, that specifically, particularly stand out as being required in a supplement, because we just simply don't have them in our foods, because our food is unfortunately becoming of lower quality, as obviously as the manufacture of food becomes more business-like, and and agriculture becomes more business-like. Unfortunately, the quality of the food is dropping, and therefore those people who are concerned about that, I think, will ultimately have to turn to some dietary supplementation in order to be able to maintain their health. And one of those nutrients that I feel is possibly required in a supplement is chromium. So I hope that was interesting. Remember to eat well, stay healthy and protect yourself, and I will see you soon for another video. Take care.